They're right, there's not long to go now for the full release of Humankind, with its official release date pegged for the 17th of August, and we just recently heard from the Humankind developers, Amplitude Studios, about these, the patch notes for the day one patch. We heard about things like a new system called Pollution to help manage late game lag, a diplomacy, quality of life improvements including tutorials, and some adjustments to the AI. However, it got me thinking, really, is this it? Is this everything that's changing on the day one patch? Because I don't know about you, but I seem to recall the beta, or the beta, was very similar to the OpenDev, which was very similar to the OpenDev before it. And so I got thinking, well, I trust these developers, so what are they actually up to? I went digging across the internet far and wide to try and figure out what else they could be adding to the game for its release, because I am as anticipated for it as you are, and I ended up there, on the Humankind Forums, where I found an old forum post from back before the beta, during the OpenDev in April. Now, it detailed what they were going to be working on up until release. Here you can see it. They said, sorry, the game's not coming out in April, it's actually coming out in August, but we're working on a whole load of different things for you. To try and make up for it, they gave us a couple of avatars, and they said, don't worry, leave it with us, we're working on these changes, we'll keep you up to date, and looking forward to seeing you at our new release date, pinky swear, promise, the 17th of August. And I do believe them. But when I went digging through this list, I realized there are a lot of things on this list that we haven't seen in the beta since. So, without any further ado, let's discuss some of these changes, because it's really all-encompassing, from pacing and balance right the way through to onboarding and user interface. First up here, you can see for pacing and balance, largely the changes are around that early game era, the Neolithic era, when you have nothing. You spawn in, you're looking for food, you're looking for science. And I think that's one of the things that's really important throughout all of these changes, is how the game's pacing doesn't quite match up to the era that we're in, and that we see again here the developers acknowledging that difference. The main issue that I heard from you guys in the comments as well was that the early game eras, including that Neolithic era, basically spanned far too long, some 70 or 80% of the game, and we didn't have enough time to spend in the final eras. I mean, that's one way to fix the late game lag, isn't it? You just remove the late game. However, that doesn't quite work, and we see the developers acknowledging that even in some of the underlying aspects of these points. Look at their mentions to stability, for example, and changes to research costs. All of these ultimately relate back to the pacing, particularly of the early eras, and I expect us to see in full release a much more stripped down, simplified, quick Neolithic era. It was one of the things that really attracted many players to Humankind, though, so I think it's important not to take it away fully, but just to acknowledge that actually there are a lot of fun cultures and units, indeed modern toys and games and so on and so forth from the modern era that we'd like to spend a little more time with, and I think that's what the developers are getting at here. How do I expect it to change from the beta to the release? I expect it simply to be attuning to the percentages for how much it costs to research things, and for how quickly we can earn era stars to advance to the next era. I expect our early game eras to shrink and our late game eras to grow, particularly around that new pollution system, moving forward past the industrial era. The next lot of changes sort of build on those era star adjustments as well, but with more of a focus on buffing and bringing certain aspects of the game in line with others. First and foremost, I think we can't ignore the fact that even by the end of the beta, there was still a significant underpowering of both money and influence relative to other earnings in the game, particularly food and science. Okay, I think we all have to admit that influence in particular was far too easy to earn and stockpile. You didn't even have to be going down a hard out influence game plan, i.e. you didn't have to pick civic after civic after civic after civic culture. You could sort of just accidentally accumulate influence, and indeed many players found the same thing with money as a resource generated from cities. Both of these things needed to be buffed and brought in line with food and production in particular. However, when it came to city planning, saying the opposite was the case. Indeed, the developers have consistently found that both the market district in particular, as well as its adjacency bonuses, weren't up to line with the rest. And I think if any of you have played it, and indeed I can reflect on my own playtime with the OpenDev and the beta, that they're absolutely right. There was never any competition. You went for growth, maybe those productive industries as well, maybe science, but really it was all about growth in this game. And they have really some serious work ahead of them if they want to fix that. But I think they're doing some good headways, and I expect that in the full release we'll see more balanced districts. Here again, they talk about the rebalancing of cultures that I think can go hand in hand with these changes. They can buff certain unique districts to ensure that certain yields are sort of catapulted back up into a respectable level. Next up, I think we can expect significant changes both to diplomacy and warfare and how these two cross over. For starters, I think there's some really base level improvements that they've acknowledged many times that we should expect. We should expect the diplomatic notifications in particular to be a lot more straightforward to use. These were often buried along the right hand side of the screen, or they would stack on top of each other. You could have like 5 or 10 different diplomatic notifications from a single other culture, let alone the other 4 or 5 in the game. So there's a real need to streamline them to really help with the player experience. I think the actual system itself at a fundamental level was okay. It just needed to be supported by better user interface experience, and the developers, Amplitude Studios, have acknowledged that Humankind is going to shift that way. They've also acknowledged that they'll be accompanying that with what I like to think of as the newbie support. And this isn't to say necessarily newbie as in bad players, but just how can we help people into Humankind and make it as easier of a transition for players coming from completely different genres or familiar 4X titles to become comfortable with the game. This includes, and I'm really thrilled to say, things like video overlay tutorials. So when you mouse over something, not only will it say, for example, let's say this unit fires within 2 tiles, 3 tiles if on a hill. And when you mouse over it, and instead of just getting that text, you can get a small, granted relatively low-res video, but it sort of just plays that out for you so you can actually see it happening on screen. I like that a lot, and I hope that they really take this to the extreme level, or at least as far as they can, to really help us players feel comfortable and at home. It makes things much easier to explain and understand, and for me, that's really important. Other changes here as well include changes to the trade menu. The trade menu does need some simplification, but also it needs to be really clear what value you're getting not only from your trades, but also from these war negotiations. Pressing demands, receiving demands, war support, so on and so forth. This will be streamlined on release, and I'm really excited to see how they're going to streamline the system, because it's a great system, and it does exactly what it should do. It just needs to be a little bit more polished. If you've made it this far through the video, by the way, you are one of the few people to make it this far in, so I've saved the juiciest changes for the end. Do let me know down in the comments below if you made it to 8 minutes 20. Anyway, we have 3 really big ones, okay? First and foremost, they've announced that they're going to bring clearer definition and explanation to the fame mechanic. Now, I've described it already on my channel. If you haven't seen those videos, do go and check them out. But basically, fame is score. It's a combination of all the different elements of a victory combined to make you famous, and you win by being the most famous. However, it's not always clear and upfront exactly how much fame you're earning and how you can get your next big boost of fame. They've promised to really bring this to the front of our screens, to the front of our attention, and I think that'll make a big difference for us because we'll have an objective to follow, indeed an achievement to strive for. Second up, changes to the AI, and this is actually second and third because these two are very interrelated. Firstly, they've told us that the AI is going to be tuned to be better at warfare. What does that mean? It's entirely not clear, although often in 4X strategy games that means more aggression. Now, that may not necessarily be the case for Humankind, and again, actually, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. I think this does a reasonable job at making it more difficult for the player because they're being attacked and they have to balance priorities, but I'm not sure if it's the best way forward. Lastly, better predictions. So the combat auto-resolve will be much better, and I think for lots of us, Oh, that'll allow us to breathe a sigh of relief for when we can't be bothered planning out every single intimate detail of the battle. That concludes this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, do consider subscribing to our small growing community, and I'll see you next time.